Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Gomes with Job Service Kalispell. Thank you for joining us this January to attend the kickoff of our spring season of Blueprint for Business Success seminars. Please take a moment to help us identify the businesses benefiting from today's seminar by entering your name, title, business you represent, and your city in the chat box. We ask that you please be polite and respectful to all attendees and the presenter. Attendees are muted during the seminar, but we encourage you to use the chat box for asking questions, which will be answered at the end of the presentation. Completing the 2-minute anonymous survey at the end of the seminar helps us improve this program and provide meaningful topics and content. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from Cindy Carpenter as she presents on the topic of documentation, discipline, and terminations. Cindy holds the 2 top human resource certifications. With over 25 years of business and training experience, primarily focused on human resource and people topics, Cindy has been a practicing human resource professional in the banking, insurance, and manufacturing industries, as well as owning her own business, Carpenter Business Resources, LLC. As a business owner and as an HR professional, she understands the challenges faced by companies regardless of size or industry. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Cindy Carpenter.
Wow, thank you, Sarah, and thanks to everybody for joining us today and being a part of our session. As I look through the list of participants, I'm pretty awed at who's out there. Many of my HR peers are there, and I'm grateful to have you on board, so thank you so much. There we go. Always a technical difficulty for me. I wanted to do a quick review as we go into documentation, discipline, and terminations, because we did have a break in December, and we should talk about this kind of being a series, if you will. In October, Rhonda Wakefield did a presentation and provided everybody with great information about the importance of hiring right. She talked about the value of job descriptions and having a strong and consistent recruiting and hiring process. Clearly, for those of us in this business, we know that hiring right is the first step. And then in November, Deb Broadbent talked to us about the performance management process, and she made many great points, but one of the key critical ones was how important communication was in all of our performance management processes. It's critical, it is continuous, it could be collaborative, and most certainly reflects upon your company culture. So with that quick review, I wanted to then talk about 3 topics together: documentation, discipline, and the termination process. I sometimes feel like I got the short end of the stick here because no one wants to talk about terminations. Just kidding, all of you. But nonetheless, I do want to point out that when we're talking about documentation, documentation goes throughout the entire performance management process. And so we can talk about good documentation, things that Rhonda talked about in her presentation, as well as what Deb talked about in November, as well as the fact that we need it desperately when we're talking about discipline or termination processes. So again, documentation, good and bad. It is, in greater terms, necessary components of the people side of your business, all 3 of these things. If you want your business to thrive and survive, obviously there's some expectations that you'll set, some standards that you have, and goals that you have. And again, documentation is almost always a part of all of those standards that you do set. I can't stress it enough. It was stressed in the other 2 presentations, but ongoing communication with your staff, with your people, is critical for the success of your business. And that includes that good kind, as well as the tough conversations that we'll probably talk a little bit more about today. And then obviously consistent delivery of all of your expectations and feedback is key. You can't assume anything as a leader or an owner of a company. I'm a little preachy on my first slide, but before we break down into the individual components, there are some things that I think we should talk about as the whole. And as some of this is your responsibility as a business owner or a business manager or a leader in your company in some way. There are things that you bring to the table. There are things that your employees bring to the table. This is a collaborative relationship that you have. And there are some responsibilities that you inherently need to have. And if you have leaders in your company that don't have the training or maybe don't have the experience or new to the role of being a leader, these are things that they need to know about as well. It's really important that you understand what your company handbook says, what your policies are, and what the procedures that you operate are as well. For those of you who don't have a company handbook, we can talk about that a little bit separately, but know that there are, at least in your business, usually procedures, operational procedures, and policies that you live by. Those are the things that you need to be aware of in your company, and so do all of those people who are leaders. You should be informed about your company, meaning that you should understand something about their goals or strategic plans, something about the budget that they operate under, most definitely understanding about their day-to-day operations and the history of the company. Again, this is all about being able to communicate with your employees to set the expectations that you're hoping to achieve, whether it's production or service. I think it's important that everybody understand that they have a responsibility to lead by example, that no matter what phase of the employment process we're talking about, but most certainly in documentation and in the discipline process, it's critical to lead by example, to be practicing fair and consistent implementations of your processes or of a disciplinary process, for example. It's really important that your employees understand what their job responsibilities are. And you'll notice I added job descriptions. Again, I work with a lot of businesses as a consultant that don't actually do job descriptions. So at least they need to have a role defined for that employee. It doesn't necessarily have to be a full-fledged description, although I would encourage that. But you can't assume that your employees can perform to their peak advantage if they don't understand what their responsibilities are. So part of your documentation process includes that conversation. Can't say this often enough, and you've already heard it both in the prior two presentations and everything you read everywhere, that you have to communicate frequently with your staff. You need to be clear and concise in your communications. Again, you've heard this before. And then I think you have a responsibility to set standards for your team, and you need to live by the standards that you set. For example, if you say you're going to meet quarterly with your staff, whether it's one-on-one or as a group, then you should do that. To say it and not do it sends the wrong message. I think it's important to spend the appropriate amount of time to accurately provide performance oversight, do it on a timely basis. Those are things that you heard in the previous presentation by Deb. She did a great job of giving us great information and tools. And again, be proactive in providing training and education to your teams so that you don't have to have some of the tougher conversations later on. And that could be procedural training or even group training such as workplace conduct. Again, from an overall perspective, there are some hints I'd like to share here, some ways of the road, if you will. And I think they probably apply throughout the entire employment cycle, but very specifically for documentation, disciplinary, and termination processes. It's critical that when you're having a conversation with your staff that you use specific examples to illustrate any message that you wish to get across. And when possible, use something that's quantifiable or numerical. It doesn't work to say you didn't do that right, or you need to do it better. What works is to say, this part of what you were doing is not correct, and here's why. Or we expected you to be able to do so many widgets, and you're not doing that many. And so it could even be number, or answer so many calls, or produce so many products. So again, very specific examples, very important. Be sure you're actually measuring duties, the key competencies and key result areas and expected behaviors. And again, don't assume they know. This goes with that discussion about what their role is within your company. You want to help them be successful, so measure exactly what you've asked them to do. And again, this is all about documentation. I always tell the companies that I work for that it's really important to honor your employee and yourself by providing the right environment when you have any other conversation. And again, many of you right now are thinking about, oh, that tough conversation, but I'm all talking about all conversations. If somebody does a good job, it's okay in front of the group as you're going by to say, high five on that, you did a great job, or kudos to you, that was really well done. Everybody loves to hear a positive in the environment, and that's a milestone. But if you have to redirect someone's behavior, then or performance, then it's important to do it in the right context and also in the right place in a private area. And if you are redirecting performance, keep in mind that it should be solution-based. There should be an action plan tied to it. Whether it's a tardy issue, saying you can't be tardy, or here's what our handbook says, you've already had 2 tardies, 1 more, and there are consequences, or how can we help you do this, or what training do you need? All of those examples provide solutions. And again, not just that blanket statement says that you're not doing the job right. I think we always need to keep in mind that for almost every situation, we want to focus on positive delivery and results. Again, you spent a lot of time hiring this person, you spent money and time recruiting them, you've spent time in the orientation process and getting them settled into your culture. So to assume that something's not going to turn out successfully is really the wrong approach to take. Let's assume that we can coach someone to be successful. Let's assume that we can help them to achieve the goals that you need and that they would like to achieve as well. And I say as appropriate because there are 1 or 2 times where it isn't about a positive delivery, it's about an absolute, there are no variances here, this is what has to happen. And you all know the difference. When you give feedback, it's important to describe the behavior in the documentation, but don't judge it. And when I work with particularly sometimes newer supervisors and managers, or those who have less experience, they have a tendency to have an opinion which they don't keep to themselves. So avoid emotions, avoid assumptions, and avoid that predetermined conclusion. I've heard this, and I'm sure many of you have before too. It's like, well, there's no sense talking to them because they just don't get it. Well, that's not going to get you success if you go into the conversation with that idea. And it certainly won't help with any of your documentation or throughout the disciplinary process. Again, attitude should be helpful, not dominating, not disparaging. And I emphasize this multiple times, but it's so important that your documentation and your conversations should include facts and specifics, but don't include your opinion or your personal judgment. My tardy example I'll use probably several times because it seems to be so real, but when you as a supervisor feel that someone's late because they've stayed out too late the night before, or that they're going to call in sick on Monday because Super Bowl Sunday they stayed out too late, that's an opinion and that's a judgment. The fact is that you have a time frame for somebody to be at work, and that's what you should be focused on. So with those overview comments, let's kind of break into documentation. We have 3 different topics today to go through. And you see my slide here, it says it can make or break you. And for those of you listening, and many of you I know have gone through this, and for myself as an HR person, we know this statement all too well. So here are some comments in relation to documentation. First of all, consistency is key. As you heard before, it starts at the recruitment time. It continues throughout the evaluation process. It's pervasive through the entire employment cycle. And again, that reminder, what does your handbook say about performance or discipline or terminations? It is your responsibility to know. And the reason I bring this up so many times is that not all of you just have people all together in one office. If you have people that work out in the field or work out in a shop area, or maybe you have different locations, it's critical that everybody is operating under the same set of principles. Excuse me. If you don't have policies that support performance or disciplinary or termination processes, might time to be thinking about creating them. Because what you've done in the past can set a precedent if you don't have any specific handbook, especially. And again, my tardy example, if you have one area that doesn't do anything about tardies, but yet another area does something very harsh about tardies, what you have is a mismatch or an imbalance, and that can create a liability or a risk for your company should something escalate into a legal action. Make sure all your managers, your owners, and any others who participate in the documentation process are utilizing the same process and the same timing. Again, this can present a risk for your company if they don't, and that my tardy example supports that statement. And also remember that all documentation is discoverable. Make sure that whatever you're saying and writing down is really based on facts and not opinions, or not statements of suppose this happened, or your best guess. It can't be about your best guess, because all documentation is discoverable should you have a situation that escalates to a legal matter. So what does documentation really look like? It's everything. It's your emails that you write. Keep that in mind for those of us who have a tendency to maybe vent a little in emails. It's not a good place to do it. It's any written statement. It could be any customer communication. It could be coworker statements. All of this could be verbal or written. Even your sticky notes. Even your sticky notes could be discoverable as documentation. And that's a good reminder. Again, maybe those of you on this call or session today, you may already know this, but it's a good reminder to make sure that everybody who's in a leadership role also knows that. And again, documentation supports good performance as much as poor performance. If you want to give someone the top evaluation, the excellent or awesome or whatever words you use, make sure that you have the documentation that supports why they are at the top of the pool in their performance. So good and well as bad. I like to point out that it's good to have a practice in place where you coordinate this information. Again, for those of you who maybe have field people or shop or any, different areas, physical areas, it's not okay to have this kind of information sitting out on someone's desk or in their toolbox, or where, in the dash of their vehicle if they work out of their vehicle. So put some practices in place to make sure that all performance documentation and anything to do with your employees gets centralized in one spot. That could be a hard copy file, which most of us are used to, but it could be virtual files. A lot of businesses are going virtual. I work for a company now that there's trying to be paperless, and so they've created an actual spreadsheet for every employee, and it has security on it, so not everybody can get to it, but all of these conversations are noted in that particular file. And obviously you can buy software to house documentation as well. Just a small example here of what documentation might look like. And again, this might be a little tiny print, I apologize. But here's just an example of a spreadsheet for a call center. And remember, I said things are really helpful if you can provide numerical or quantifiable data. Well, here's just an example of how one company might log calls for someone, and they're by the day, the number of calls, how long a conversation was, what their wrap up was, total time. This is an example off the internet. So my point about that is your documentation doesn't necessarily have to be formal, but what it should be is similar for positions with similar duties. comparing apples to apples, if you will. Dates are important and some description is important. Otherwise, documentation doesn't have as much impact, particularly if you're talking about things that happen sequentially. If you can't say, well, on this date, I spoke with you about this, I reminded you on this date, and we've had a third conversation on this date. That's the kind of documentation that you want. So dates are important. And again, your businesses are different, so you know what's important within your business. Documentation can be narrative or numerical, as in this example, and sometimes a combination of both is really most appropriate. But if there's redirection needed when you are preparing your documentation, the action that's required and needed, as well as the timing of such, should be noted. Again, if I come into your business to help you, I should be able to look at your documentation and it should paint a clear picture to me as to what you're trying to accomplish and the time frame that you'd like it to be done in. Here's just another quick template that I wanted to bring before you. This is a one-page performance improvement plan. This is straight off the internet. And it's free. There are so many opportunities for you to put some structure into your documentation and your processes. And templates are such a great help. Again, the internet offers hundreds of examples. We have a lot of different businesses represented on their call today. So many of you have industry-specific organizations that you can go to. It might be in manufacturing, could be in the financial services. So there are, you don't have to reinvent the wheel is my point, I guess. And I always have to put a plug in for HR's national organization, the Society of Human Resource Management. It's a great resource. If you don't have HR in your company, and even if you do, I recommend a national membership as well as a local chapter membership if you can do so. The resources offered there are just phenomenal, and it's more than forms and templates, although that's something I use frequently. But even as we were going through the COVID processes early on and nobody was quite sure what was going on, they had great resources there. So give that some consideration. But regardless of what your resource is, do what makes sense for your business. Again, don't reinvent the wheel. Don't get too elaborate if that's not what you need. Think about what's right for your business. So that's kind of my discussion about documentation. I want to move on to progressive discipline and talk a little bit about how your company might handle it. And again, you'll notice that I've used the word progressive discipline because most companies that I've worked with, this is the form of how they help redirect performance and behavior. So just a quick note on the definition. I think we know it, but just in case, progressive discipline is a process of applying disciplinary actions, moving from the less serious to the more serious, and then based on what the initial severity or repetition of a problem or a behavior. And again, you'll see my stop here, because what does your company's handbook say about disciplinary processes and procedures? You have to follow what your handbook says. To deviate from that, even if you think it would be better, without acknowledging what your handbook says, creates a huge liability and risk for your company. So be sure you read carefully what your handbook says. You seek assistance when you need to from an HR resource and get legal advice when it's necessary, and most certainly work with your management or your owners. You know, people look and say, well, do I really need to get a legal advice? And I can tell you that that'll be the best $200 you've ever spent, because it might save you thousands later. And for a number of us that are on this call or seminar today, we've lived it, and we know that to be a very true statement. So when you're talking about discipline, there are some things you need to consider. You should consider what the offense is, what happened, what your policy is, or if you don't have any policies, what your current procedures or processes might be. Obviously, you have to consider what the law says and what our legal federal state laws might be about whatever happened. You have to consider the circumstances. You also have to consider the employee. And I bring this up because let's use the example of tardies again. If you have a new employee that's been with you for 2 weeks and they've been late 8 out of the last 10 days, you're already thinking, did I make the right hire? But and you have to talk to them, of course, but if you have an employee that's been with you 20 years and they've never had a problem being to work on time, they're a good employee, and suddenly they have a spate of tardiness, your conversations are likely to look a little different, and rightfully so. And you'd also look and consider what past treatment of similar problems or situations within your company that might have happened before or have existed before. So these are all things to consider when you're trying to figure out at what point of the process you are administering some discipline, and how it fits for this situation. Excuse me. So I break it down into what I call informal actions, and this is that progressive disciplinary process. And again, a number of you are very familiar with it. And there are variations of it. So this is just one variation. I talk about corrective counseling. And my 2 bullet points here is when should it be written up and placed in the employee's file? And whether or not it is placed in the employee's file, I always recommend that a record of this conversation be kept. This is this informal conversation that you have with someone. This is somebody who's been late 3 days this week, not like them, whatever. You need to sit down and say, hey, I can't help but notice you're always here on time, but you've been late for the last 3 days. Is there something going on that I can help you with? And maybe they say, oh, I'm sorry. It was my week to drop off the kids at school and I didn't plan accordingly, or my car's been in the shop and I've been getting a ride or whatever. Maybe it's as simple a conversation as that. Do you write that up? Well, I believe that you do. I don't believe it's a formal write-up, but what I do believe is that's a quick note that so-and-so was late, these 3 dates, and on this date, I had a quick conversation. Looks like it's a problem that's been fixed, and then it's end of story. But you should have that note in case there's a problem that surfaces later. Then we go to the oral warning. And again, should this be documented in the employee file? There has to be a record somewhere. And yes, I believe it should be. And if there's an oral warning, a more serious conversation here, is there a requested action and timeline that is a part of this conversation? And again, it's not okay to say you didn't do this right without adding some very specific examples and some expectations and timing. And again, examples of appropriate oral warnings might be that tardiness example, which I'll use until you're sick of it probably, or something like I left the lights on and the door unlocked when I left the building last night. That could be a very serious situation, if you have confidential information for security reasons, etc. So it might be more than, hey, you forgot to lock the door. It might be, hey, this is a pretty serious thing. And whatever your checklist is for leaving at night, this one can't be missed kind of conversation. Then I talk more about formal actions, which again is this progressive process, a written warning. And here's where I've seen lots of variations throughout my time in HR. They could have one written warning. You could have a first, second, last chance, third chance, final chance. I've heard a number of different variations. It's what fits best for your company, but typically there is more than one warning. And again, we don't have time for a long conversation on this, but if you've had this warning and 60 or 70 days or 6 months go by and nothing happens, then it happens again. It may be not the second warning, but it may be the first again, depending on what your processes are and what your handbook says. Some things are forgiven after a certain period of time, but written warnings are often used for repetitive violations. There's also suspension with or without pay. Oftentimes you'll see this when there might be a safety issue. That could be where a situation, I actually helped a company one time do an investigation where 2 employees had gotten into a fist fight on the night shift when nobody was around. And so both of them were on suspension until the investigation could be completed. There could also be a disciplinary demotion. That might also be a result of an investigation. It also could be disciplinary demotion if someone is perhaps becomes a supervisor and they find that they're not cut out for that. And it might be that they've had the training, but it just isn't right for them. They find they don't like it. They want to go back out in the field or on the production line. So their performance has led them to a discussion where in fact there might be a demotion in happening. Or lastly, which we'll talk more about, excuse me, is a discharge process. And I point out here that you should never take this lightly. You should be able to look yourself in the mirror and say, I've made every effort to make sure that this situation didn't get to discharge. But it happens, and there are times when we do have to do this. It could happen because of a severe safety violation. Obviously, it could happen if there's a proven theft or if in fact the performance simply cannot be met. Whoops. Lastly, when I talk about disciplinary process, remember a few slides ago, I gave you an example of a performance improvement plan. This is a valuable tool in the disciplinary process if used properly, and I've seen it used very well in many cases. It generally is put into place when an employee is not performing to expectations, and perhaps there's a need to provide additional coaching or training. This can happen if you hire someone and you believe that they are maybe further along in their experience than what they actually are, or they have difficult time adjusting to what your processes are. It doesn't mean that you're going to throw the book at them and that they have to be gone. What it might mean is that there's a need to provide them with additional coaching or training that's very specific. And again, the actions with a performance improvement plan or a PIP, they're usually very specific. They're very well identified what's not at the level of expectation and how we're going to address that, and what the timeline is. Typical of a performance improvement plan, 30 days should be where you want to hold it to. And I don't think often it should be longer than 60 days. It would be very rare to see it longer than 60 days. Obviously, it requires some regular feedback and meetings. That means you as the owner or manager or leader of your company, you have to be committed to this plan in order for this documentation to work or this disciplinary action to work. If you say you're going to have those meetings, you have to do that. Again, definitive measurements tied to success. At the end of 30 days, our expectation is you will meet this benchmark. And it is certainly okay to have this fall within the formal action processes of an evaluation, a disciplinary process. So something to think about. So moving on to terminations, checking my time here. It's important to do them right. Can't say it any more simply or forthright than that. They have to be done right. Generally, two types of terminations, voluntary and involuntary. The voluntary ones, I think we all know fairly well. The employee comes in, gives you a note and says, I'm leaving, my last day of work will be X. And then the involuntary, obviously, when the company makes a decision to terminate employee, and that can be done for a variety of reasons. It could be performance related, it could be an incident, could be because you're downsizing or restructuring, or certain policy violations, okay? Regardless of which type we talk about, there are certain processes that remain the same. My focus today will generally be on the involuntary terminations because they're a little bit more difficult to deal with. I do want to make the point, though, that even on the voluntary terminations, somebody moves on. It's important to have them exit in a positive and professional way. That we live in a small community and people do talk, and so that's one reason, but also things change for people, and while they might not be a good fit now, it doesn't mean they might not be a good fit in the future. So always keep that in mind. I can't stress enough on the involuntary side that you have to review your process and the decision that you're making. Make sure that documentation is accurate. Make sure that you have it all. Make sure that, again, if I came in to help you with this process, that the picture would be painted, that I wouldn't have hardly any questions about what's going on and why you're ready to terminate. And ask yourself, have you done everything that you can to make sure that this is a successful working situation? Again, nobody wins from terminations as a general rule because they cost a lot of money. And you hired someone, you spent all that time recruiting and hiring, the orientation process, all that you've done to train them and get them to fit into your culture. Make sure you've done everything that you can to help this be successful. Absolutely, if you're ready to terminate someone, you should have discussed this with the management team or your owners or whoever that next level up is, your HR department, while still maintaining confidentiality. That second review, the consensus is very important. Someone else might have a different set of eyes or a different viewpoint than what you're hearing and seeing. Should you engage legal counsel? Not necessarily every time. That's a decision you have to make, but please don't shy away from it. Again, that $200 that you spend might be the best thing you've ever done. Making sure that again, they're the legal experts and they can guide you appropriately. And then give some thought to who's going to be involved in your termination process. Don't do it alone. I think we all know that, but always have someone else present. And then anticipate the reaction and the timing of how you deliver a termination. Again, those of us in the HR world have seen a whole lot of unusual things happen. Some people will cry, some will be angry, some might thank you. They might be happy that they're gone because really they weren't happy either. But you need to know enough about what's going to happen to be prepared for those different reactions. Whether it's voluntary or involuntary, this is the biggest takeaway I can give you today. Use a termination checklist. Again, there's hundreds out there if you don't have one, but most of you could sit down and literally write down all the things that you know need to happen when someone leaves your company. If you are terminating involuntarily, I recommend that you do a termination letter with just the facts, no opinion, don't elaborate, simply the facts, and provide a copy of your complaint resolution policy to an exiting employee. This allows them the formal process to respond back if they have concerns or complaints. And so for those of you who don't have this, you might consider adding this to your list of policies. Make sure that you've gone over the benefits in the final paycheck. For example, company-sponsored life insurance almost always terminates on the same day of the termination, where insurance is typically through the end of the month. Know what your company's situation is. Make sure that if you don't have that final paycheck ready, that you have it in your handbook when final paychecks are issued. The state has some very specific rules about that on an involuntary termination. Think about the security for your building, the computer. Think about the return of company property. That includes equipment, keys, door cards, credit cards. Some people will ask if the company provides references or recommendations, and that's, again, whatever your handbook says. And then think about staff communications as part of your termination checklist and the documentation. Better that your staff hear about somebody leaving the company, not the details, but the fact that they're gone, than having them talk about it in the lunchroom or over the water cooler. And then obviously that checklist helps with the internal paperwork and what document retention dates you need, what vendors need to be notified, etc. So as I bring us to a close on terminations, I have some fundamental takeaways that I think span all of our communication processes, again, whether it's documentation, whether it's discipline, whether it's termination, but actually in the whole performance management process. I feel that these are 5 statements that everybody can benefit from, regardless of what area you're thinking about within your company. No surprises unless it's a gift. Somebody that was a great mentor to me, actually, I've stole it from her, but it really makes a lot of sense. If you're going into a performance evaluation with someone and you're going to give them a poor evaluation, that should not come as a surprise to them. If we've done our documentation, if we've had our disciplinary conversations the way we should have, when they get to the evaluation process, they should have a fairly clear understanding of what to expect in that. So that's just one example. Those surprises that are a gift, that, hey, great job, kudos to you, that's when a gift is appropriate. It's important to anticipate behavior and get ahead of it. Again, I'll use my tardy example. If someone who's a brand new employee is late the first 3 days, there's definitely probably a behavior pattern that you want to address or get ahead of right away. I recently did some work for a company and they hired an individual and he came to work the first day, and the second day he called in and asked if he could use one of his float days. So he read the handbook, where we know we got that part done right, but we had to have a little conversation, I think, with that individual about, well, you probably could use your float day, but what's going on? So anticipate behavior and get ahead of it. Behavior that goes unchecked is condoned. Again, the worn out tardy example. If you have one department that doesn't do anything about it and another department that's absolutely rigid about it, then what happens is the people that never do anything about it, suddenly it's okay to be late. Not to mention the risk and the liability that you put forth for your company. And then avoid management by telepathy. Remember when I talked early on about don't assume that your employees understand what they're expected to do entirely, or what the true position and roles that they've taken on, or what their responsibilities are. If we document in advance what those are, even if it's having them sign a job description or having them sign a checklist of these are the primary functions of the job you have, this is your role with the company, then we know that we've had a clear and concise communication. And otherwise, we can't just assume that they know, right? And again, avoid management by telepathy. And then again, and lastly, it follows up with the other one, perception really is reality. And if suddenly everybody can be late, then the perception is that we can be late, and that's not a problem, and that does become reality. So those are some fundamental takeaways that I had for you. And as a final note, before I hand it back for any questions and comments, one of the discussions we were having right prior to getting live here today was so many of us have remote staff, and how can we apply all of this to a remote staff environment? And I want to encourage you to know that it doesn't change. It doesn't change just because they're not in front of you, doesn't change the fact that you would do the same documentation or have the same conversations. Again, we're all getting better at Zoom. We certainly can pick up the phone. We can use email. Some people use chats or instant messaging. The conversations still need to be happening, and acknowledgement of the documentation still needs to happen. So it really doesn't change anything. It might just make it a little bit more difficult to do, or at least it feels more difficult. I think most of us feel like we do better when we're face to face with people, and it makes it a little bit more difficult to have some serious conversations when we're not. But we get better as time goes on with Zoom, and remembering the things that we need to do. And this is exactly where we should be taking it, just because we're working in remote environments right now, and even because we have a pandemic going on, and times are tougher. It doesn't mean we aren't empathetic, but it does mean that we still have documentation to do. We still have a handbook and policies and procedures to follow. So if you have any questions about that, I'm more than happy to do that. So with that, I think I'm close to my time frame. So Sarah, I will hand it back to you.
Thank you, Cindy.
Yes,
that was excellent presentation. Everything from expectations, standards, goals, ongoing communication, lead by example, consistency, checklist. You really hit so many important points that it's surprising how often we really do need to be reminded of the importance of these things. And I think you hit those really well. The 5 tips that you brought together at the end was a great way to wrap it all up and make it feel relatable. So thank you so much for that. And now we'd like to go ahead and open it up for a few minutes of Q&A. If anybody in our audience today has some burning questions for Cindy, please feel free to type them into the chat box. We'll address anything that we have time for. And I see here that one question we have for you, Cindy, is there have been times when we, the employer, are honestly glad to see someone leave. You made the point about leaving any employee with a good final impression of your company. Talk about that more.
Well, yes, and I've been one of those people as well who, for whatever reason, perhaps it just isn't working out, and I'm honestly relieved that this person has decided to leave the company. And it's okay to feel that way, but what we need to do is make sure, as I said before, that we still handle that exit process with all the same checklists and all the same professionalism levels that we would anybody else, and wish them well in their future endeavors, because as we know, times change, people change, and it doesn't mean that that person might not be eligible to come back to your company in the future. So that's one thing. And then secondly, what you do want them to do is walk away from your company with a happy face, so that they can walk out and say, well, I'm not working there anymore, but it really was a good company and they treated me with respect, versus going out on Glassdoor or some other mechanism and saying, oh yeah, that place is terrible. So I think it's important that we keep that in mind. It's okay to feel that maybe it's a better move for them to leave, but we still handle it the same way.
Yeah, I think that really supports your tip about how perception is reality.
Absolutely.
And really makes that relatable there. We do have a question from Rhonda. What is your recommendation on notifying staff of employee termination? Tell everyone, only the department?
I call Rhonda and make her do it. No. No, good question. That's kind of on a case-by-case basis. I really think that at minimum it should be that department, and it doesn't have to be a big formal communication, and it doesn't have to be secretive either. A simple email out, if that's how you communicate, or a simple pull that supervisor in and say, look, so-and-so is no longer with us. You're aware of that. Please let your staff know, because oftentimes there are things like who's going to fill that shift or who's going to take on that responsibility. So it turns into, hey, this is just another course of business action. If there's a senior level person who's no longer with the company, oftentimes you'll see a more formal communication, from a higher level owner or official.
Okay, thank you. I don't mean to rush you here, but we have some questions just pouring in.
Keep going. All
from,
right.
from Chris Carlson, with the progressive model, does the problem need to be one improvement and not several, or shotgun approach?
Well, I not to not answer the question, Chris, but I mean, I really do think that depends upon the situation. So I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. And again, we could maybe, I'd be happy to talk offline about that if you had an example, but again, it's what works in your company that follows within that procedure and in the handbook.
Yeah, there are just so many scenarios where it's a case-by-case basis, huh?
Right, right.
Alyssa Cordova is asking, how do you address a situation where an employee keeps threatening to leave and tells you they are applying for other jobs, but still has not quit? Is this grounds for termination? This is not addressed in our handbook.
I don't think it's grounds for termination based on what you've said, and I'm not an attorney, so anybody else who I know is on the call or on this could step in. But by and large, it is a behavioral problem, and it is worth the conversation of saying this is getting in the way, I think, of your production or your performance. It's making other staff uncomfortable. So let's have this conversation and figure out if there's something we can do to help you be successful. You don't, I get that there are times when you wish you could bring it to a head and they would quit. I get that, but by and large, it's a conversation, because it's not necessarily in their role to talk about that all the time. And it's probably causing some problems in their performance and how other people feel. it's documented, right? That's the whole point of it. We've had this conversation. We've given you the opportunity to speak to it. Boom, right?
I can see how that would definitely be a delicate situation, and that documentation would be your best friend in that case.
Right.
From Tammy, how might we hold employees to a standard of attendance, even though they've been recommended to stay home if they're sick or if a family member is exhibiting COVID symptoms? An example is someone who misses 180 hours of work over a 4 months period.
Well, COVID presents a different set of challenges because we really are encouraging people to stay home, but there are things that we can do. For example, you can put a process in place that talks about what you're going to do related to COVID. If someone calls in and they say, I'm not feeling well, what are your symptoms? And are you going to stay home? This example I just did with a company that I do some work for, and they have a whole matrix of how you can help these people make the decision to come in or not come in, or if they've been tested, et cetera. So COVID adds a whole different scenario, and it would be very difficult to hold someone accountable disciplinary wise for either being exposed to COVID, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a little bit of a separate discussion. And again, I would put some processes in place. I'm more than happy to share that with you if you want to get a hold of me afterwards. Secondly, if they're just regular non-COVID related, not coming to work, and you have an attendance policy, you need to hold them to it. And that starts with a conversation that's documented. It might progress into written warnings, et cetera.
Oh yeah, COVID is constantly giving us more room to grow and show that we can do these same tasks in other creative ways.
Yes. Yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question here. What kind of training is involved to have your documentation and processes in order?
Well, I think that I call it, if you have those processes in place already from a leadership standpoint, then I think that's supervisor or leadership or management training. That's conversations that you need to have with the staff that's going to utilize these processes so they understand them. And maybe that's simply roundtable work group discussions. Yes, people like Rhonda and myself go out and do this training all the time, but nonetheless, you can do it yourself if your processes are in place. It's a matter of saying, this is how we want to handle our disciplinary processes. This is what our handbook says. Here are the forms that we're going to use, and lay it out just so that they aren't guessing about what your expectations are. And again, this is mostly for your leaders, supervisors, managers, et cetera.
Great. And famous last words. I know I said that was the last question, but another good one came in, and I'm curious what you have to say about it. From Miranda Hull, what would you do if the employee wants to stay working for your company, but is also saying that they are going to go out on their own, providing the same services?
Well, I've done that. That's a conversation that, again, is on a case-by-case basis. Depending upon what you're doing and if there's a conflict of interest, and if your company has a handbook that talks about conflict of interest, it may not even be something that can be done because it is a true conflict of interest. But for example, in my former years, I used to do some work for another entity that was not in the same business that the company that I worked for was. And because there was no chance of there being a problem of competitiveness or such, it was allowed. So it's very much case by case. I can tell you that the more difficult thing is not necessarily about the confidentiality. It's about determining who gets first shot at that person's talent, right? And so many companies don't like it, and it would have to be decided on a case-by-case basis.
There are so many case-by-case bases.
Yes, they are.
A big thank you to Cindy Carpenter for giving her time and sharing her expertise on this topic with us today. That's all the time that we have for questions today, but feel free to reach out to Cindy if you have more questions you'd like to speak with her about. Now, following a few announcements, we will leave up Cindy's contact information in case you do have more questions for her or would like to request a copy of her slide presentation today. Now, a quick reminder for those who have not reported their attendance yet to please enter your name, company name, job title, and city in the chat box. Next month, we look forward to our February Blueprint for Business Success seminar, Creating and Retaining a Diverse Workforce with Andrea Harden from the Montana Human Rights Bureau. This will be a special opportunity for SHRM-HR professionals to earn free CEU credits in diversity training. In March, Blueprint will pause to focus on the Kalispell Safety Fest Montana 2021 and ABC clinics. Blueprint returns in April with wage and hour and independent contractor exemptions in Montana, presented by Logan Jackson from the Department of Labor and Industry, Employment Relations Division. As a reminder, there will be an anonymous 2-minute survey that pops up when you leave today. Your participation will help us improve this program and provide meaningful topics and content. Thank you again for attending.